I'm going to talk for a little bit about the Mongol Empire. This is one of the most critical periods in human history. It is the period that led to the Black Death, which was the worst instance of epidemic disease before the discovery of the Americas. And it is one of the most formative periods in global history. The modern world has come about in part due to the long-term effects, inadvertent effects of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire was the world's largest contiguous land empire. It's the second largest empire of all time, behind the British Empire of the 19th century, but the British Empire was an overseas empire, the Mongol Empire being a land-based empire. At its core, the Mongol Empire was able to exist due to the great valor of its warriors. The Mongols, like all of the Central Asian nomadic groups at the time, lived as what we call horse nomads. They followed around flocks of sheep, goats, horses, from watering hole to watering hole in the grasslands of Mongolia and in the Gobi Desert. And because watering holes and pasture, good pasture land, was relatively rare, there was constant fighting between nomadic groups. In fact, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but even marriage was based around fighting for many Mongols. This made Mongols extraordinarily talented at cavalry warfare. They lived in an environment that was completely flat, with even terrain, perfect for cavalry warfare, and they were master riders. By the age of 2 or 3, Mongols would be on horseback, doing tasks, gathering up sheep. By the time they were 9 or 10 years old, they were able to shoot a bow and arrow from horseback at full gallop and kill another human being. This made them extraordinarily lethal on the battlefield, not just because of the shock power of a horse charging into a foot soldier, but because of the fact that the Mongols could move so rapidly, mass troops so rapidly, and strike so quickly. If we look at the Mongol Empire, we can see some evident characteristics. For one thing, you see in green, this is the empire at the death of the first great Khan, Genghis Khan. You've heard that name before. We'll talk more about him in a moment. And in the orange is the territory at the death of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. I'm sure you've heard that name also. One thing you'll notice is that 2 of the world's greatest civilizations, China and Persia, what's now Iran, and Iraq, which before the Mongol conquest was one of the most prosperous portions of the globe, they're overtaken completely by the Mongols. You have virtually the entirety of Central Asia, you have Korea, and you have the developing Russian civilization. You can see here the divisions of the Mongol Empire at the time of the death of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and the different political entities that emerged out of the split. One thing the map isn't showing is that eventually the descendants of Genghis Khan would actually conquer India as well under the Mughal Empire, which we'll talk more about in another lecture. One thing you can notice from this map, though, is that all of the territories that were incorporated are territories that were relatively suitable for cavalry warfare, or at least adjacent to regions suitable for cavalry warfare. And this is important. The Mongols did fail to conquer several regions, and these were regions where their horses were not able to be used to great effect. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. One thing to point out is that Westerners often referred to Mongols as Tatars. And the Tatars were an actual tribe that existed in Mongolia, but they were taken over by the Mongols and absorbed into their culture. But if you've ever heard that term, Tatars, we're really talking about Mongols. And there is a really great quote here by Aladdin al-Malik describing how quickly the Mongols could mass in numbers. The Mongols were never very numerous. They were always outnumbered by their enemies. But because they were entirely mobile, due to their mastery of cavalry warfare, they could strike where the enemy was not. They could move very, very quickly, and they could gather a large amount of force in a specific location very fast. And this gave them a massive advantage over their more sedentary enemies, who had to rely on, for example, the Great Wall, which had gone into disrepair, a state of disrepair. As I stated earlier, the Mongols subsisted off of following around herds of goat, sheep, horses, and there is in fact a video that I'm going to include of a modern day nomadic family and describing how their children are educated. And these are people who are living in a manner similar in some respects to those of their ancestors from the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. At the time of Genghis Khan's birth, Mongolia had no cities. He would later build a capital, build a city called Karakorum in Mongolia that would be his great capital. But the Mongols didn't live in one place. They moved from place to place constantly. And they live in what are called yurts, which are kind of tents that can be disassembled, assembled very rapidly, and taken on the move. The Mongols inhabited what was called a steppe, a giant grassland that was in between the forest, the great forest to the north, and the mountains to the south and west. And it's kind of like, if you can imagine, in the United States, we have Kansas and Nebraska, a vast area of that, moving from and living in a manner similar to many of the indigenous populations in those Great Plains states of the United States did. They would follow buffalo and later on horseback. Well, the Mongols did something very similar, a similar lifestyle. And of course, in the Great Plains, the tribes of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Kiowa, etc., these were great warriors. And it's also true of the Mongols who lived in the grasslands. Following around herds of animals requires a very militant culture in the technology, given the technology of the time. The Mongols owed their military success to more than just their abilities as riders and warriors from horseback. They were also extraordinarily hardy. This is due to the fact that steppe life was very, very rough. If you know anything about deserts, they can get surprisingly cold at night, even when they're hot in the daytime. In the Gobi Desert in Central Asia, it's very extreme, with temperatures at night going well below freezing. And the Mongols would endure these difficult circumstances, often long periods of starvation, long periods of extreme discomfort, and it produced very hardy warriors. For example, the Mongols could remain on horseback for days at a time. And if they got hungry or thirsty, they would commonly, if they had a strong horse, cut a vein in the horse's neck and suck the blood directly out of the horse for nourishment. You know, these are the kind of individuals who came up in this culture of extreme hardship. And of course, because resources were scarce, violence was extraordinarily common. And the leadership that emerged in this very violent world was very ruthless and cutthroat. And often it was the most capable men who rose to the top, rather than those who had enjoyed the highest status at birth. And the Mongolian steppes gave birth to one of the most successful rulers of all time, which was Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's birth name was Temujin. In the tradition of many Mongol warriors, Genghis Khan's father, Yesugi, had defeated a rival warlord and named his son after his defeated enemy. So Temujin was born. And Temujin's mother had actually belonged to a rival tribe. She had been kidnapped by Genghis Khan's father, and that's how the two became married. This was very, very common practice for women to be taken during warfare and taken off to be the wives of enemies. It was a very, very harsh world. In fact, there are some practices today where in parts of Central Asia where they have a kind of a modified form of bride kidnapping as a ritual more than an actual kidnapping. But this goes back to this time in which women were taken as part of tribal warfare. In fact, I'll include a video, an optional video, on the contemporary practice of bride kidnapping in Central Asia today as kind of a ritualistic activity, not not in the manner that Genghis Khan's mother and later wife would be taken. Genghis Khan, or Temujin's father, Yesugi, was poisoned by rivals, and the boy was left destitute with his mother and brothers. Now, Yesugi knew that he was being poisoned. He had stopped he was taking his son to be betrothed to Borte, Genghis Khan's future wife, when they were very young. And during the trip, they were stopped by some Tatar warriors who offered Yesugi some alcohol. The Mongols drank lots and lots of alcohol at that time. They drank a type of alcohol, kumis, made from fermented mare's milk. And they offered this to Yesugi. And to show that he was unafraid, even though he had suspicions they were trying to poison him, Yesugi drank every last drop to show how, and then held the bowl over to show that it was completely empty, that he was completely fearless. And of course, they did in fact poison him, and he died. And all of his followers abandoned Temujin and his mother and brothers. So his children and his wife and children were actually left destitute after his death because they felt that the small child wasn't capable of truly leading them. But Temujin turned out to be one of the most dynamic people who ever lived. He was physically very powerful, extraordinarily intelligent. He had an ability to lead and to persuade others, and he was also extraordinarily ruthless. In fact, he killed one of his brothers over a fish he had caught that his brother had stolen, at least according to the secret history of the Mongols. Temujin then shot his brother in the back with an arrow, killing him. And this was conflict among brothers is a long part of nomad history in Central Asia, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the Mughal Empire in India, which was ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan. But he was extraordinarily ruthless, and he was able to, through the use of alliances, rescue his bride, Borte, who had been kidnapped and taken by warriors of another tribe. He was able to rescue her and then build, thanks to this heroic act, able to build a coalition around himself and ultimately ultimately unify all of the Mongol tribes under one banner.